The craziest drugs that you have never heard of. At this point in YouTube history, I think everybody has watched at least one video about crazy or obscure drugs. And while these videos are interesting, usually if you've seen one, you've seen them all, and typically the entries are rather surface level. Fortunately, this video is different. We're gonna cover drugs that are so random and so unknown by the general public that even super niche internet communities don't know about them. Oh yeah, and this list gets crazier as it goes on. Let's begin. Salvinorin B methoxymethyl ether. If you thought of salvia when you heard Salvinorin in the jumbled mess of scientific smart people speak, then you would be correct. But this isn't just regular salvia. This video is about drugs you've never heard of, and this stuff is way crazier than regular salvia. In fact, I think a good name for this would be super salvia. But in case you're unfamiliar with regular salvia, let me recap quickly. You see, with regular salvia, from every trip report that I've seen, using salvia is almost a guaranteed miserable time. And even at that, the bar is so low for salvia that even a good experience is pretty much just not being as traumatized as the majority of people that take it. But Salvinorin B isn't regular salvia. This drug is salvia's crackhead cousin. Honestly, for all intents and purposes, this drug is probably one of the most cursed compounds ever made for a variety of reasons. For starters, the National Library of Medicine states that this chemical is among the most potent and selective kappa opioids known. And in this case, stronger is not always better. To this day, there has only ever been one reliable Salvinorin B trip report. And that's simply because even some of the most seasoned psychonauts don't want to touch it. Likely because it's a cursed compound with a ridiculously long half-life. According to sources, Salvinorin B is 5 times more potent than Salvinorin A and lasts for a duration of 2 to 3 hours, which brings using this drug into the realm of sheer insanity. If you were crazy enough to want to try this drug, you would need to heavily mentally prepare yourself beforehand, because breakthrough drugs like salvia and DMT are known to cause time dilation, which means that your trip could feel longer than it actually is in real life. Time dilation is one of those things that's commonly discussed online, yet nobody really knows how or why it happens. In a post I found on the DMT forum, a user states, "I felt like I lived an entirely different life in the DMT world. It felt like 10 years or so. I even had a family." And if that's not crazy enough, another user commented on this post saying, "This happened to me on salvia, and I had absolutely no awareness of this life. I lived a whole lifetime in another life, and then zap, I'm in my bedroom. It was unsettling to me." And another user discussing his trip wrote, "What feels like an eternity only lasted 15 minutes. Keep in mind, this is just regular salvia, which only lasts 5 to 20 minutes. Considering Salvinorin B is 5 times more potent and lasts about 15 times longer, it's no wonder why so few even dare to try it. So what happened to the person that did take this compound? Well, for that, we actually need to look at the research paper. Yeah, a research paper. The doctors here had the psychonaut in the study measure his dose in micrograms, which is extremely tiny. An average dose of regular salvia is measured in milligrams, which is obviously much more. The psychonaut in this study, which is basically just a fancy name for someone who likes psychedelics, said the following about his experience with Salvinorin B. "My head was observed to retract, and my face was frozen in a frighteningly blank expression as if I were having a stroke. My hands adopted a strange pose and waved around very slowly, alternately creepily awkward and graceful. I remembered none of this." Then, when talking about actually breaking through on the chemical, which basically means losing track of your current reality and entering hyperspace, they wrote, "I wasn't actually perceiving any objects in my environment. It was my mind that I was perceiving, as a manifestation of the movement of a 5-dimensional object through a 4-dimensional membrane." Whatever that means. Considering this was such a minuscule dose, I can't imagine the trip report someone might come back with if they took a full send level dose. Luckily for you guys, there is actually one other trip report on the entire internet, although it isn't reliable as an actual research paper. This trip report is simply titled, "I cannot comprehend what happened," and it's actually written by a career chemist who synthesized the compound himself, and upon taking it was transported into an entirely different life in the 1950s. This is his quote on the experience. "I fell through my floor into an endless array of eerie sounds. I eventually reached the bottom and felt my body hit the ground. A creature walked towards me and grabbed me by the neck and said, 'I don't know what you're doing,' in a disturbing voice. Then he threw me up and I landed. I stood up and realized that I was in the 1950s. The trip went from impossible events to me simply existing in a different time. I walked around on this street and found a newspaper on the ground. I could read each and every article, and on the top it read August 6th, 1953. I didn't know that it wasn't real. It was all I knew. I could remember my life, but it wasn't me. It was the life of a person that I was in 1953. I could remember my childhood, school years, first job, everything. As potentially cool as it may seem to almost time travel, this one part of this one story doesn't make this compound seem any less terrifying. 4-CMA. Like many of the obscure chemicals on this list, finding information on 4-CMA is not easy. That's because 4-CMA is a research chemical. If you don't know what research chemicals are, they're basically synthetic chemicals that were Frankensteined in a lab as part of a research project in an attempt to either improve on an existing chemical or to create an entirely new drug. Basically, research chemicals are the result of scientists crafting random stuff like they're brewing potions in Minecraft. The thing is, most of these chemicals don't make the cut, typically because they either have terrible side effects or they aren't useful medically, or they just lost funding on the research. If the established drugs that most people know about are the tip of the iceberg, then research chemicals pretty much cover the rest of the iceberg all the way to the bottom. 4-CMA is a research chemical that was originally synthesized in the 1960s, as it was supposed to be a stimulant that behaved similarly to an amphetamine. Despite what scientists expected, however, 4-CMA had a much more antidepressant effect than stimulant effect in test subjects. But because it was mildly pleasant to use, drug dealers actually pressed this into their own pills to evade authorities. According to sources, 4-CMA was first identified at the Tomorrowland Festival in 2015, where a tablet was found in the possession of a drug dealer. Then it seemed to have disappeared, while a study conducted in 2019 reported detection of 4-CMA in pills once again. Now you might be curious, why is the slightly pleasant antidepressant on this list? Well, it turns out that this drug is highly neurotoxic to its users. In studies done with rats, it was found to permanently reduce serotonin, and in further studies done on it, it was also found that, quote, administration of 4-CMA caused a prolonged reduction in the levels of serotonin in the brain 1 month after injecting a single dose of the drug. In other words, it physically kills your serotonin receptors permanently. Now, to make things worse, there are still vendors that are knowingly selling this toxic chemical with no regard for the general public. This is bad because these drugs can easily end up in a wide variety of recreational pressed pills that are sold on the black market. In regards to this, in the Research Chemicals subreddit, one user wrote, "Nice. A substance that could fry your brain like only a lifetime of MDMA use could in one sitting," which I feel is pretty accurate. And it's even been reported that abusing this chemical could leave you with, quote, an irreversible depression that would be like an MDMA come down every day for the rest of your life. Although it's been speculating that reaching this state would require multiple large doses over a long period of time, if you don't want to take the chance at permanently damaging your serotonin neurons, I would strongly recommend staying away from this drug. I almost want to call 4-CMA super MDMA, but it's really not the case. It's honestly just the worst of both worlds. The upside of MDMA is completely subdued in 4-CMA, and the downside of MDMA is amplified to such an extreme degree there is absolutely no value in the trade-off. Pyros. No, not the TF2 pyro. Pyros is an abbreviated word for the class of drugs known as pyrrolidinopherones, and they're pretty much crack on crack. If you remember the bath salts epidemic from about a decade ago, well, pyros are to blame. They're pretty well known in the fringe drug community as being the most addictive class of chemicals on Earth. And when I say most addictive, I'm talking about 20 times more addictive than crack. These drugs are absolutely insane, and they don't even hold a candle to the mainstream drugs known for their addictiveness. For example, with commonly known drugs, most people actively decide to stop using it before their supply runs out. This is definitely not the case with this stuff. Barely anyone in recorded history has started using a supply of pyros and just stopped halfway through out of sheer willpower. In most stories on the internet, people who start a stash of pyros only end their days-long bender because they became full-blown psychotic and ended up in a psych ward, or if they're lucky, started seeing shadow people early on and got scared enough to flush the rest of their supply down the toilet. But this stuff is so addictive that I'm convinced somebody has flushed their stash down the toilet and then immediately gone sewer diving afterwards on a quest to find his precious like Gollum in Lord of the Rings. Because of this, even the most seasoned drug users won't take this stuff because the compulsion to take more is practically impossible to overcome. In hindsight, it's no wonder we had a bath salts zombie epidemic. Just to clarify, bath salts are are literally just Pyros. Imagine you're trying to quit a chemical that's 50 times more addictive than crack, and every time you make a stop at the gas station for your nightly Twinkies, a scraggly old dude in the back who smells like salami is tempting you to buy it for a couple bucks. The thing about the bath salts epidemic was that whenever authorities finally got around to outlawing the latest chemical, the drug lords that sold them would just hire some armchair chemist on the internet to look for slightly different chemicals on the dark web that kinda looked the same. Keep in mind, they wouldn't even know what the side effects would be. So basically, they were pretty much just selling random research chemicals to homeless people as test subjects. Because of this, a lot of people got caught up in bath salts addiction around 2012 because they had no idea how addictive they would be. But that's not even it. The most diabolical aspect of Pyros is that they make you extremely horny. I'm not joking. Like a 64-hour edge session with no break or sleep until you literally pass out from exhaustion or get submitted to urgent care. They say that meth can turn you into a gooning degenerate, but this stuff is like meth times 5. To make matters even worse, somewhere along the way, armchair chemists on the internet somehow figured to conveniently turn this compound into vape juice, which pretty much makes this invention the world's worst jewel. So the next time your mom gets mad at you for your vaping addiction, feel free to remind her that there's some 45-year-old dude with scraggly hair in his basement vaping super crack and jorking it for 10 days straight. The amount of gooning behavior Pyros cause would literally make your average Discord moderator look like a Buddhist monk. Long story short, outside of their extremely addictive qualities, these drugs are well known for turning you into a D1 gooner. Like legitimately the Michael Jordan of gooning. From what I've read, this drug easily makes you the biggest degenerate in the world. Trust me when I say, Pyros are one diabolical class of drugs. 5-MeO-DMT. 5-MeO-DMT is basically DMT's mysterious grandfather. If you think the sorcerers we talked about in the medieval video were mysterious, you'll be even more intrigued by this chemical compound. This chemical is sometimes nicknamed the God molecule, and surprisingly, unlike other chemicals on this list, this substance is actually naturally occurring. But this isn't found in a mushroom or tree bark like normal drugs. 5-MeO-DMT is naturally occurring in toad venom, of all things. I mean, talk about hardcore. Unlike the more forgiving and consistently spiritual trip brought on by regular DMT, whether or not 5-MeO-DMT is going to be a glowing spiritual experience or an existential crisis was basically a coin flip. And that's a problem, because if you choose to inhale this stuff, it is reported that this trip could last up to 2 hours, which is 8 times longer than regular DMT's duration of roughly 15 minutes. And unlike most psychedelics in which people usually report pleasant experiences when they use the drug with reverence and respect, 5-MeO-DMT doesn't care how nicely you treat it. And that sucks because if you have a bad time, you could have a very bad time for up to 2 hours. Additionally, in my armchair psychologist opinion, I'd wager that a bad trip on 5-MeO-DMT is at least 10 times worse than a bad trip on regular DMT. To prove this point, I'm calling upon a popular website known to host trip reports. On this website, there's a category for bad trips. For context, with regular DMT, some titles of bad trip reports include First Breakthrough, Ego Loss and Bad Trip, Accelerating the Evil and Ego Death, A Cautionary Tale, Unprepared Liftoff into the Worst Case Scenario, and Too Much for a First Time. Which, to be honest, pretty much sounds like they either took too much or experienced ego death, which is kind of a normie experience with psychedelics. Now, on the other hand, here are the titles for bad trip reports on 5-MeO-DMT. Existential Horror, Pure Horror, Facing Psychedelic Terror, Unimaginable Deaths of Terror, and I Ended Up Praying to Jesus Christ. Yeah, it's not a super fun way to spend your Sunday afternoon. Honestly, as a word of caution, if you're prone to existential anxiety, I would shy away from reading any bad trip reports altogether. Now, it seems like a common theme in these reports that people actually think that they're about to die or actually dying while on the drug. Now, I don't know about you, but taking a drug that makes me believe I'm actually dead and now my only friends are Casper the Ghost, the Grim Reaper, and Harambe totally sounds like a blast. Not. One reason for these reoccurring death themes in trips might be that 5-MeO-DMT is one of the only psychedelics that has the actual capability to kill you. You see, usually psychedelics can't kill you unless you do something really dumb under the influence. 5-MeO-DMT is different though, because unlike most psychedelics, this drug has caused death in at least 2 cases, with the 3 major causes being, quote, suffocation after vomiting, lung shutting down, and cardiac arrest. One interesting trip report I found about 5-MeO-DMT wrote, I cannot emphasize enough how insanely weird, alien, and utterly cosmic this felt. Like I'd broken some type of rule and I'd entered an entirely different universe of some type. If you ask me, 5-MeO-DMT is nothing to mess with. At all. Duster. I know what you might be thinking. What on earth do you mean by duster? The nickname your elementary school bully gave you in 4th grade? A brush for dusting furniture? An American indie rock band from San Jose, California that was formed in 1996? Okay, nobody was thinking that one. No, I mean air duster. Air duster is the one drug that I can't state this clearly enough, you never want to use. And the reason is way more insidious than you may think. Duster kills your brain cells. By the way, air duster is not just compressed air in a can. The reason air duster is actually considered considered a drug is because it's mostly a refrigerant, not air. And because this gas is heavier than air, when most people are using it, their voice becomes very deep
and my voice gets really low
and sounds like a monster. Basically, when you inhale, the chemical replaces all of the oxygen in your lungs and removes carbon dioxide in the same way that regular air does. All the while, your body is getting tricked into thinking that it's inhaling oxygen because there's no carbon dioxide building up. This causes the user to get hypoxic, which is basically another word for painless brain suffocation. Essentially, Duster makes you suffocate without your brain sending you into fight or flight mode, which often causes euphoria as a byproduct. This might sound cool or fun until you realize that every time you get high, you're giving yourself insane amounts of brain damage. This is because your brain can only bear around 2 to 5 minutes of hypoxia before your brain cells die permanently. To make things even worse, usually Duster abusers will use this stuff for hours on end or until they pass out. So instead of just minutes of killing their brain cells, they're doing it for hours a day. According to numerous anecdotal sources I've seen across online, this is one of the hardest drugs in the world to quit. I know this sounds ridiculous, but this is a reoccurring theme on this list. For example, in a post titled "My Story of Air Duster Addiction," one user on Reddit wrote about how addictive this stuff can really be. In this post, he writes about the first time he tried it. Quote, "One blast and I was done for. I felt like I needed to feel this way for the rest of my life. I cannot describe the euphoria." Then, according to his story, he went to rehab, but immediately after he got out, he relapsed, writing, "I got a job that I lost, but I received a paycheck for around $200 and literally went on a ridiculous binge on Duster in my car in the Walmart parking lot. I easily huffed over 50 cans in a 48-hour period. I seriously couldn't stop." He ends the story with saying, quote, "This stuff will make a mess of you and will take you down faster than any hard drugs out there. This is not some kiddie drug. Like I've said, I've tried everything, and nothing is compared to the insane rush of euphoria you get from Duster. If you use Duster, even short lengths of abuse can cause permanent brain damage, serious memory problems, seizures, loss of IQ, a loss of one's ability to focus, confusion, a permanent loss of coordination, permanent slurred speech, and death." With that being said, the biggest reason to not use Duster is the fact that Walmart, of all things, would become your new drug dealer, which might be one of the lamest ways to die of all time. On a big forum called "Do You Know Anyone Who Permanently Fried Their Brain from Drugs?" to nobody's surprise, Duster and inhalants in general was the most commonly mentioned drug in the replies. And that's because most drugs don't kill your brain matter. Many of them will change your brain's chemistry, but in most cases, your brain can make a full recovery over a long enough period of time. But this is not the case with Duster. In response to this question, one person in this thread wrote, "I worked at a movie theater, had a coworker who was above average intelligence. He got into inhaling air cans. After 3 months, he was pretty much the dumbest person I ever knew. He didn't make much sense and he thought everything was so funny." Another user wrote about their Duster experience, and I think it's safe to say that this stuff is definitely no joke. According to the poster, they, quote, "probably inhaled dust off 3 to 10 times a day for 2 years. Then they talk about when they finally quit it. Quote, "By the time I stopped, I could not understand language much. I couldn't understand the concept of family or why anything worked how it was supposed to work. Sometimes I read and words suddenly looked like foreign shapes to me and I can't decode them in my head. I'm lucky I'm not like that to this day." Yeah. Definitely don't take this drug if you value your life. All in all, I'd wager even the most hardcore drug nerds out there haven't heard of at least one of the chemicals I mentioned on this list. But if not, don't worry, because this is just the tip of the iceberg. To summarize, some key takeaways are: don't use 5-MeO-DMT unless you want to buy a 2-hour timeshare in the shadow realm. If the weird guy from high school who took way too much interest in organic chemistry tells you he has some super salvia, don't take it. If a smelly looking guy with a blank stare starts eyeballing the air duster in your shopping cart at Walmart, don't give it to him. Don't ever take black market MDMA at a rave because it might cause an endless depression. And don't listen to anyone that says using bath salts is a good idea. And please, for the love of God, don't hit someone else's bath salts vape, especially if it feels sticky. Source? Trust me, bro. These videos are a product of me venturing down hundreds of rabbit holes on the craziest drug forums and websites I could find. EA3167. No, not EA Sports. It's in the game. EA3167. Close though. What happens when you create some type of mad scientist coalition of some of the best chemical engineers and scientists in the world, paired with billions of dollars in backing from the United States military budget? Well, you get a chemical weapon that's so brutal even Darth Sidious would be impressed. This wartime designer drug, and I'm not even exaggerating, might be the most extreme non-lethal drug I have ever heard of. In all honesty, this atrocity of a chemical is so ungodly and just plain eerie that it's inconceivable to me why this has even been created in the first place. Like, I can't even understand who would bother imagining such an unnecessary extreme compound to begin with. First, let's begin with some context. EA3167 is what would be known as a deliriant. If you've ever seen a YouTube video on what it's like to take too much Benadryl, such as seeing shadow people and spiders everywhere, forgetting everyone you know and not remembering how to read anymore, having hallucinations that you can't differentiate from real life, and sometimes forgetting language entirely, the effects of these large Benadryl doses happen because it's a deliriant drug. In general, Benadryl is effective at treating allergies, fever, and flu-like symptoms. But as many of you know, in high doses, Benadryl starts to get super unpleasant, to put it mildly. This is because in high doses, Benadryl is what they call an anticholinergic. Or, in non-nerd terms, it makes your memory about 80 times worse than Joe Biden's. Right, but why is Benadryl anticholinergic? Well, because it's old. Benadryl was released for prescription in 1946, which means that Benadryl is turning 78 in 2024. I'm guessing when scientists discovered it, they were too caught up with all of the stuff that it cured to think about the fact that it crossed the blood-brain barrier to begin with. They were probably like, why does that matter? It's not like anybody over the age of 8 is gonna take a bunch of allergy pills to get high off of. Actually, that's exactly what happened. But like I said, old antihistamines such as Benadryl and other designer deliriants like EA3167 happen to cross the blood-brain barrier, which blocks your brain's ability to use acetylcholine, which is really bad. That's because acetylcholine helps regulate things like sleep, wakefulness, memory, and focus. So basically, getting exposed makes you feel like you're literally going insane. And from everybody else's perspective, you just look like an idiot. You'll try to walk into doors that aren't there, talk to invisible people that aren't even around you, run from invisible spiders and shadow people, and most likely try to use your computer, forget your password, and get so pissed off that you punch the imaginary spider on your screen. However, let me be clear, Benadryl is not fun to abuse. Most people that try to use it in high doses recreationally end up being traumatized at some point, and long-term abuse can lead to early dementia. If you don't believe me, watch a couple Benadryl trip reports on YouTube and come to your own conclusion. Now that we have a better understanding, let's talk about EA3167, the drug in question for this list. In the 1960s, the US government had a new goal, and that was to make bioweapons that didn't necessarily kill people, but incapacitated them for days. This program was known as the US Military Chemical Weapons Program, and one interesting result of this program was a contract with Edgewood Arsenal, who eventually developed the psychological war crime of a drug. EA316 has the exact same effects as 3-QNB, but it lasts way longer. And unlike 3-QNB, which was just accidentally discovered, EA3167 was purposely developed and designed to be terrifying. In both of these drugs, the effect is simple. It incapacitates your brain's ability to use acetylcholine, which, like I said earlier, is essential for memory and not going insane. If somebody wants to get you to do this stuff, they probably will. It's a white, crystalline, odorless powder, completely soluble in most liquids, including water, and has delayed symptoms several hours after contact. It also has a half-life of 3 to 4 weeks in moist air, which means that your enemy could spike your food with it and wait weeks until you eat it. It also lasts a really long time in soil. If you happen to get drugged with this stuff, you're basically going to lose your mind. According to official sources, common symptoms include both, quote, psychological and physiological effects, with the most incapacitating effect being the state of delirium characterized by cognitive dysfunction, hallucinations, and the inability to perform basic tasks. What's crazy about 3-QNB is that the US military designed a specific cluster bomb called the M44 generator cluster, which basically sent a bunch of flying gas canisters down on your enemy, creating a visible white cloud of doom. And if you got caught in it, you would become incapacitated anywhere from a couple hours to a couple of days. But that was just phase 1 of this drug. The final supervillain form of this drug, EA3167, was basically what you would call super Benadryl, because if Benadryl turns you into a vegetable, this stuff turns you into bedrock. Ingesting a tiny amount will give you a bad Benadryl-like trip, but only requires 0.2 milligrams for an average weight person, and it lasts anywhere from 5 to 10 days, with many users saying they needed 20 days to fully recover. So basically, it's akin to a 10 to 20 day long Benadryl overdose. Or in other words, it's actually like going clinically insane for at least 10 days, not remembering how to speak, how to walk, how to read, what the layout of your house was, or anything else really. Considering military leaders were planning on drugging enemies with the stuff from a handshake, if you were incapacitated by EA3167, you would probably believe that you had permanently lost your mind. And the worst part is, you would have no idea what was wrong with you. Also, because acetylcholine is the most important neurotransmitter for REM sleep, your brain would get very confused and no longer be able to tell the difference between reality and dream. In fact, this is why your hallucinations are so strong on anticholinergic drugs. They simply put your brain into a REM-like sleep state while you're still awake. So what you see and what's actually real become indistinguishable in the worst ways possible. And because of this, in my opinion, that's what makes this one of the cruelest chemical warfare drugs ever invented. But wait, it gets worse. Because for some cruel reason, the US military thought it was a bright idea to test this drug on human subjects. And sadly, some people simply never recovered from the terror of losing their ever-loving mind for 10 to 20 days. For example, one source states, quote, "Even 6 months after exposure, a few subjects demonstrated significant increases in the scores of depression, hysteria, schizophrenia, and mania scales." In other words, if you got drugged with this stuff, it's a pretty good chance that you'll never be the same. And even worse is you might permanently lose your mind. Okay, really quickly, I actually wanted to break the fourth wall. I know you guys enjoy watching these videos, so I wanted to kind of take you behind the scenes and show you quickly. I felt like the best way to show you is by exposing one of the biggest tools that's helped me, and that tool is Notion, which just so happens to be the sponsor of this video. And in this segment, I want to quickly show you some of my favorite parts about Notion and also some of their new and improved features. On Notion, you can create any workspace you want, and as you can see, I've lovingly named mine the Trust Me Brotion Notion. On Notion, you have a lot of options, but what I want to show you quickly is my exact tools. One of the best things about Notion is that it's extremely easy to use, and they do a really good job of teaching you how to use it, kind of like a video game tutorial. Now, full transparency, this is a dummy account that I quickly made for this segment. I do use Notion, but I don't want to fully expose my back end, if you catch my drift. For starters, Notion is an extremely easy tool to track your monthly budget. Imagine all of the tools available in other software suites online in one place in an easy to use and nice to look at format. That's basically Notion. This may look like a simple spreadsheet, but trust me when there's so much more that you can do with it specifically. Another thing that I love to do is track my to-do list. Here, let me add a few tasks and I'll show you exactly how this could work. So for example, now that we actually have a few assignments in here, we can actually track our exact progress on what we're working on. For example, my English assignment, I finished it. Learning Japanese, that's something I'm doing right now. And Become 3D, I haven't started that, and sadly, I don't know if I'm ever gonna be able to do that. But the best part is each of these tasks, you can actually click on it and add any comments you want, add more details, and even assign it to other people if you are sharing a project with potentially classmates or friends of yours. And I do have a couple other pages, but let's not get into those. What I do want to get into though is the amazing amount of templates that are right there. If you feel overwhelmed with making your own template, you don't have to. If you go to the template workshop, there are so many free, great themes available for almost any use case. And as you can see, they have templates for work, life, and school. So no matter what your biggest priority in life is right now, they've got you covered. But one thing I want to touch on that is the newest innovation when it comes to Notion is this squiggly little guy right here, Notion AI. It is crazy how much this little guy can do. Just look at him. Look at his little faces. And besides Notion being one of the best places to actually hold your knowledge base, basically making it a second brain, their new AI tools actually allow you to create brand new documents from scratch. For example, let's have it make me a flowchart. Like, look at this. I just asked it to make me a flowchart about how to be good at YouTube. And honestly, this isn't a bad place to start. And this is just the first go. Now, the best thing is I can take it, edit it, and even share it with other people, which is great. So now, guys, let me just speak from the heart and end this segment. Start your Notion but seriously, if you guys are using a to-do list that's on your Notes app, or if you guys are using Google Docs or something similar for all of your organization, I would highly recommend you get Notion for free and even try their new features using my link in the description. Thank you, Notion, for sponsoring this video. Galantamine. This drug is deep on the drug iceberg, but not because of how obscure it is. In fact, some people already know about galantamine because it is often used to treat Alzheimer's. But what not everybody knows is what niche internet communities use it for, which I'll be getting into. But first, let's talk about how galantamine works. Remember the chemical weapon we were just talking about? Well, this chemical is actually the exact opposite. Galantamine is what you would call a cholinergic drug, which basically means that it increases acetylcholine in your brain, which in turn improves your memory, wakefulness, and focus. So unlike anticholinergics, it makes you the opposite of a vegetable. So, a fruit? This is really helpful for people with Alzheimer's, but it also has another even crazier use. Like I mentioned earlier, acetylcholine is a super important neurotransmitter for REM sleep. Well, because of the effects these drugs have on your cholinergic system, Benadryl makes you asleep when you're awake. And by asleep, I mean a waking nightmare. But cholinergic drugs like galantamine make you awake when you're asleep. And because of this quality, people on the internet have figured out that if you go to sleep and then set an alarm 4 to 6 hours after you fall asleep to catch yourself in the middle of a REM REM cycle, take 4 to 8 milligrams of galantamine, and then quickly go back to sleep before the galantamine kicks in, the galantamine will take effect on your brain while you're in the dream, which will give you about a 50% higher chance of lucid dreaming. And if you don't know what lucid dreaming is, it's basically realizing that you're in a dream and pretty much doing whatever you want, like flying, gaining superpowers, or even walking around the corner and hoping that your brain will make your celebrity crush appear. And considering it makes your memory and focus better, most people that have tried this method for lucid dreaming say that the galantamine makes their dreams feel like they're dreaming in 4K. Basically, used during the daytime, galantamine is a mild limitless pill, and used during the nighttime, it's like the red pill from the Matrix. Interestingly, this chemical being used for lucid dreaming has also been studied, and one study called, quote, pre-sleep treatment with galantamine stimulates lucid dreaming, concludes that, quote, the percentage of participants who reported a lucid dream was significantly increased for both 4 milligrams and 8 milligram doses of galantamine. But this isn't really deep enough for a video titled 5 Crazy Drugs You've Never Heard of, so I want to go a level deeper. There are actually people who take specifically designed stacks of nootropics, which are basically just legal supplements that affect your brain's functionality, in order to get the clearest, most vivid, and long-lasting dreams imaginable. I honestly don't know what to call these people, because they're not exactly psychonauts, but at the same time, they're still using drugs to explore the deepest depths of their subconscious. So I guess they're somewhere in between. According to some of these shaman-like dream gurus who I've talked to, apparently one of the wildest activities to do in a lucid dream isn't any of the crazy stuff you would imagine, like fighting your mortal enemy with superpowers, shape-shifting, or flying. Apparently, it's just meditating. Now, I know this sounds crazy, but these people have told me that the most fascinating thing to do in a dream once you realize that you're dreaming is to just stop and observe it. They look at the people passing by, they read a newspaper, and they listen to the random characters in their dreams having in-depth conversation. According to them, the state of awareness that they are in during these lucid dreams is more than the awareness they experience in their waking life. Colors are bright and vivid, like how they used to look when we were kids, and every other sense, such as smell, touch, and taste, is in HD. Some people theorize that this is because the brain experiences different brain waves or states of consciousness in different phases of sleep. For example, REM sleep is the state in which you dream. So basically, being aware in a dream is different from being aware in real life, because once you become aware in your dream, your mind is already at a super low state of consciousness, which would typically take years of practice to achieve regularly. In fact, many cultures throughout history have practiced this dream enhancement with various substances long before galantamine was ever invented. For example, Tibetan monks have been practicing dream yoga as a meditation technique for hundreds of years. Similarly, African tribes have used something called the African dream route to induce lucid dreams as well. Finally, one user on a popular lucid dreaming forum wrote about what it was like to use galantamine, in which he states, quote, I set my alarm for 6 hours after I was going to wake up when I went to sleep. When I woke up, I took 4 milligrams of galantamine pills and 2 choline pills, downed some water, and went right back to sleep. After some time of tossing and turning, I decided to fall asleep on my stomach, like I usually do. And just as I was falling asleep, I suddenly felt pressure on my body, like someone put a very heavy blanket over me. I'm pretty sure this was sleep paralysis. Usually at this point, I have a hard time staying awake. But because the galantamine kicked in just in time, I felt vibrant and awake even though my body was now asleep. I stayed in my bed, simply observing this feeling. And then, in an instant, I suddenly realized my body had drifted out of my real-life body. This is probably the coolest sensation I've ever experienced. Suddenly, anything I imagined was perfectly visible, as if I were looking at a 3D TV screen. Then, I imagined my fingers touching a familiar texture, and suddenly I was looking down and my hands were touching the object I had just imagined, and an expansive town constructed itself around me. Somehow, everything I could see, hear, smell, and touch was more vivid than I remembered real life to be. And upon my first attempt of flying, I was flying around this new city. I specifically remember a point where I was close to a cloud, looking down at the city, and I was just staring in disbelief at how realistic and accurate my dream was looking and feeling. I could feel the wind from flying, and everything I touched had an accurate texture. What's more is that any music I imagined synthesized right in my dream. For a moment, I felt like Hans Zimmer orchestrating an entire original composition that sounded even better and more out of this world than anything I've ever heard in my life. What felt like 2 hours from me exploring the city went by, and at a certain time I began to get worried. It felt like my brain had notified me that I should have woken up by now. But I remembered that the galantamine was probably causing a dream lasting longer than it would naturally. Shortly after this, I promptly woke up and I looked at my clock and only 30 minutes had gone by. That was the longest dream I have ever had. because I wanted to mix things up, this is one of the only drugs on the list that isn't necessarily an instant death and horror drug. It's a bit different. But with that being said, I do not in any way, shape, or form condone using Alzheimer's drugs recreationally. But the science and story behind it is interesting. Flubromazolam. For the sake of simplicity, we'll just call this drug Flubro. This drug falls under a category of drugs known as triazolobenzodiazepines, which is pretty much just a fancy word for research chemical benzos. And at that, it's one of the strongest benzodiazepines in the world. What's crazy is that it has a half-life of 50 to 20 hours, which means that if someone using this drug takes even a tiny bit too much, they're pretty much guaranteed to spend the next day or two blacked out. And I'm not talking about blacked out as in sleepwalking around like a confused Xanfi not remembering anything you did yesterday. I'm talking about going into a straight up hibernation for 48 hours. In fact, now that I think about it, a good way to put this drug would be Xanax on steroids. Research chemicals are so strong that most of the time, even the most seasoned research chemical enthusiasts steer far away from this stuff. To give you some perspective on how crazy this drug is, I want to talk about how extreme regular benzos are. One good example of this is a Joe Rogan episode where Jordan Peterson explains how severe his benzo addiction was. He recounts how his doctor prescribed him Xanax in 2019 because he couldn't sleep. He started taking them without thinking too much about it. Then in 2022, he attempted to get off of them for the first time, which caused him neurological damage and gave him severe withdrawals. In this episode, Joe Rogan also talks about how a doctor told him that Xanax was one of the hardest drugs to get off of, and how it can turn an everyday person into a severely dependent addict in a matter of weeks. Joe also goes on to tell him about another doctor that told him that there are only 2 drugs that can kill you if you get off of them, those being alcohol and benzodiazepines. It's crazy to think that these drugs can literally kill you if you stop taking them. Regardless, after Dr. Peterson undertook months of unsuccessful treatment in American hospitals in an attempt to slowly wean himself off the drug, he finally had to go to a hospital in Russia and undergo a medically induced coma for 8 days just to deal with the withdrawals of Xanax. When talking about Xanax withdrawal, Peterson says trying to get off of them was the lowest point in his life. So just to put this all into perspective, let me present you with one user I found on a popular Swedish drug forum who talks about how Flubro withdrawal is at least 10 times worse than Xanax. He states that, quote, "In just 1 week on these, at 1 tablet a day, I got the strongest withdrawals imaginable. If you thought Xanax was bad, Flubro is at least 10 times worse." So if you think quitting nicotine is hard, imagine a withdrawal that's 10 times worse than one that required an 8-day coma to escape from. Users on this forum also go on to describe the withdrawals in more detail. Quote, "When you're withdrawing from Flubro, you can just forget about sleep if you don't have any other strong medicines. I had to get more Flubro again after being sleepless for 3 nights. The worst part was my body and mind felt exhausted, like I wanted to sleep, but it just felt like something was wrong, like there was something preventing me from falling asleep." This user then states, quote, "I've been on benzos for 15 years. But 1 week of Flubro is literally costing me my life. This substance is absolutely not to be played with." Then another user commented, quote, "I've been on benzos for 10 years. I got such an extreme withdrawal from these that I was borderline psychotic. The withdrawals were so bad that ever since that withdrawal, I decided to stop taking benzos forever, and I am currently tapering off them now." We all know Xanax addiction can make you spend months of your life essentially blacked out, not remembering anything. But because of Flubro's ridiculously long half-life, month-long blackouts on this drug are on a completely different level. To demonstrate what I mean, on a benzo drug forum, one user states, quote, "Flubro blacked me out for literally months at a time. As a user, you know all of the consequences that come with benzos, getting fired, crashing your car, and spending money that you don't have. Now, crank that up exponentially, and you know the withdrawals you get? Those get cranked up too. I tried to withdraw at home, and I endured 2 weeks of wasting away before my mind snapped and I went into a full-blown psychosis and woke up in detox. I am not messing around with you when I say that this will ruin your life. And I'm not your mother, so I'm not going to tell you what to do, but I'm just telling you what's going to happen. It's turning yourself into an evil zombie and pain will follow." So yeah, benzos alone are scary enough, but these research benzos are on a different level of terrifying. MPTP. In my last video, we talked about 4-CMA, which infamously kills your serotonin neurons. Well, in this video, we're going to talk about another neurotoxic drug that's possibly worse, MPTP. Like many of the chemicals on this list, this is a research chemical, which means that it was developed in a lab and doesn't have enough historic testing and research to be considered reliable or safe. What's interesting about MPTP is that it's usually created as an accidental byproduct when trying to synthesize another research chemical known as MPPP. In 1976, a 23-year-old chemistry graduate named Barry Kidston was doing doing just that. Because MPTP gave similar effects to morphine, Kidston was producing it in a lab for personal consumption. What nobody knew at the time, however, was that when you synthesize MPTP, it comes with the risk of being contaminated by MPTP as a byproduct. Interestingly, MPTP isn't neurotoxic on its own, but it is the chemical precursor to MPP+. Once MPTP enters your blood-brain barrier, your brain turns it into MPP+, which is a potent neurotoxin that is guaranteed to kill your dopamine neurons permanently. So, without knowing any of this, Barry Kidston synthesized his MPTP in a lab, and when he was ready, he injected it into himself. Sources say that within 3 days, Barry had developed Parkinson's. He was treated with another dopamine precursor known as L-Dopa, but unfortunately he died from a cocaine overdose just a year later. Some people speculate that Kidston might have been taking cocaine to self-medicate his Parkinson's. What's scary is this isn't the only case of this happening. For example, in 1983, quote, 4 people in Santa Clara County, California, United States were diagnosed with Parkinson's after having used MPTP contaminated with MPTP, and as many as 120 more were reported to have been diagnosed with Parkinson's symptoms. All in all, this is a terrible drug, and just like 4-CMA, it was never really intended to be taken, but it still ended up being accidentally consumed anyway. Honestly, I can't decide whether destroying your dopamine-producing neurons or your serotonin-producing neurons is worse, but either way, taking MPTP is a horrible idea considering the risk that it will turn into MPTP, and from that will almost guarantee you get Parkinson's. Not many drugs that I've found have such strong, lifelong effects. I don't think I need to go into much more detail about what makes this chemical absolutely terrifying. No matter what you do, never even think about touching 4-CMA or MPTP or MPTP or any research chemical or anything at all. Don't even drink water. At this point, I'm basically terrified of everything because these drugs are insane. But we still have one more, and it's the craziest I've touched on by far. DPT. DPT is a drug that is generally just a bad deal to agree to. If you happen to have a good trip, most trip reports will just say it will be alright. But if you happen to have a bad trip, which is more of a rule than an exception with this chemical, most people agree that it's the worst psychedelic experience they've ever had. In the last drug video, part 1, I said that 5-MeO-DMT was basically DMT's mysterious grandfather. And that's true. But what I didn't tell you is that 5-MeO-DMT was just scratching the surface of DMT analogs. And this form of DMT, DPT, is more akin to the ghost that haunts DMT's mysterious grandfather. This is the next level down the DMT iceberg that not everyone knows about. Now, let's make one thing clear. DPT is not natural. It has never been found in any toad venom, any tree bark, or anywhere in the known universe thus far. And in my opinion, God was probably facepalming hard when he saw humans first make this stuff. That's probably because if you take a high enough dose, your trip can last up to 12 hours. You see, when you make a psychedelic drug in a lab and it's nowhere to be found in nature, all of those hippie arguments of, it's just a plant, bro, made by the guy who looks like Shaggy from Scooby-Doo wearing a weed-scented tie-dye carpet he bought at the Dollar General, just goes out the window. Another interesting fact about this cursed drug is that an entire cult was created around it. I'm serious. If we're being honest, you know the drug is insane when people think this drug is God. And I'm not joking, that's literally what happened. This cult is called the Temple of the True Inner Light, and the actual temple is unsurprisingly based in New York City. And if you think this sounds like some type of crazy science fiction plot, you wouldn't be wrong. It's weird because everyone talks about Scientology in LA, but somehow an NYC cult temple that worships a synthesized research chemical variant of DMT that can't even be found in nature just slips under the radar. Anyways, on their website, which is kind of hard to find, they go into detail about what they actually believe. Quote, "It is our belief that the origin of religion and spiritual awakening is the ingestion of psychedelics. In other words, the original followers of every true religion, such as Buddhism, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, believed that psychedelics are the embodiment of God. This was and is the God of the ancient prophets and messengers. And this is the light spoken of in scriptures and sacred texts. What's even crazier is that they smoke DPT in oil form, and they even have their own religious text referring to their God as oil. For example, on their website, they have one of their own scriptures that says, quote, I am writing to you about those who would deceive you, but the oil you received from him remains within you, and you really need no teaching from anyone. Simply remain in him. For this oil teaches you about everything, and is true, and is no lie. Remain in him, as his oil has taught you to do." Needless to say, I wonder if this cult would accept Joe Rogan into it. I know we've talked about Joe Rogan a lot, but here's Joe Rogan entering this cult for the first time. "Welcome, brother. We have awaited you."
Jamie, pull up that video of that bear smoking DMT. Also, pull up a Trust Me Bro video, please.
And that's totally real and definitely happened. Another weird thing about the temple's website is that they just take passages from the Bible and then just kind of add stuff to it. For example, their website features, quote, 1 St. John's 2:26. But I don't really know what saint is supposed to mean in this instance. Also, what their website says is notably different from the original scripture, with the original scripture saying, I am writing these things to you about those who are trying to lead you astray. And this website's version of the scripture is, quote, salvation does not come from the darkness. Alcohol, cocaine, morphine, dishonesty, violence. Our Eucharist is DPT, a very powerful angel of a host, closely related to psilocybin. In my opinion, the biggest problem with this cult's claims is that DPT doesn't even occur in nature, and it also fails to be molecularly similar to psilocybin like they claimed in that verse. Alright, enough about the cult, which to me is one of the most insane parts about this drug, but what is the drug itself actually like? Well, the general consensus on the internet is that this drug is just, for lack of better words, eerie. And it's also one of the first drugs I've ever found that even experienced psychedelic users have been wary of. So, in other words, using this drug would feel exactly like how you would expect using a cult drug to feel like, with many users reporting dark spiritual experiences being associated with this chemical. For example, one Reddit post I found on the substance goes into detail about why it was the worst trip they ever had. This Redditor started by saying, quote, so the other day I broke out some DPT and took around 50 milligrams. I have plenty of psychedelic experience consisting of high doses of the following: DMT, LSD, mushrooms, MDA, DMX, 4-HOMET, and some other things I'm sure I've forgotten. But even my worst trips don't even touch DPT. Nothing gets close to what I just experienced, and it was possibly the worst psychedelic experience I've ever had. He then goes on to say, quote, this is the weirdest, eeriest, and strangest, most intense chemical I have ever ingested. At first, it felt pretty good, and the visuals were quite enjoyable. But about 15 minutes after dosing, something became very off. It felt as if something had entered my body and I was no longer in control whatsoever, but in a different way than DMT. I didn't even feel that intoxicated, which was the weird and scary part. I just felt a complete loss of control. Then comes the craziest part, in my opinion. They go on to say, quote, I had an extreme eerie feeling along with extreme disassociation and possibly even slight psychosis-like symptoms. This feels like a direct pathway to communications with evil spirits. Many people who follow the philosophy of naturalism believe that designer drugs are a connection to evil spirits because they aren't naturally occurring, and thus weren't meant for human consumption. I know this is a bit off topic, but I thought it was an interesting concept to keep in mind for this specifically. The Redditor goes on to say, quote, the next night I also had extremely vivid, terrifying nightmares and sleep paralysis. During sleep paralysis, a tall, black entity had quite literally tormented me until I fell back into my dream, then continued to do so in my nightmare. I usually do not have experiences like this, and I also never have had sleep paralysis. And if you found that story creepy, the comments aren't any more comforting, with one user commenting, quote, some people are sensitive to spiritual attacks. In this materialistic, spiritually closed-minded civilization we live in, everything is just reduced to chemicals, states of mind, or psychologicalized, or written off in another way. The spiritual world is just non-existent under that frame. And finally, one last claim I found about DPT was the following, quote, I've been taking DPT and it makes me feel possessed in a way, almost like I'm the creepy dude in Hereditary. That sort of thing, I suppose. Just like I'm channeling something very intense that transcends humanity. TUCI. This drug is one of the only drugs I've covered with its name being one of the risk factors. This drug goes by many nicknames. TUCI, pink coke, but there's no one word for it, and that's kind of fitting considering there's no one recipe for it either. Now, if TUCI sounds anything similar to TUCI, you'd be correct, but these two drugs are nothing alike. TUCI is a psychedelic we may or may not touch on later, but TUCI or TUCI is not a psychedelic whatsoever, and is typically a concoction of various stimulants, opioids, amphetamines, and other things that should never be mixed together, especially with alcohol, which was unfortunately common, which we'll get into. But don't worry, it's typically dyed pink, so it's gotta be fine, right? No. If you watched my last video about rich people with strange hobbies, you would have heard me discuss Sean Diddy Combs and his extremely deplorable actions. And if you've been following that story closely, then you may have actually heard of this drug I'm currently talking about. Why? Well, because TUCI or pink coke is something that Sean Combs was reported to have used to lace the alcohol provided at his Diddy parties. Why? Because this concoction of drugs was almost always guaranteed to either render you unconscious or put you in such a vulnerable state of delirium that unfortunately you were were easily taken advantage of and, in most cases, didn't even fully remember what happened. Focusing back in on this drug, what exactly is it and where did it come from? According to my research, TUCI was created by a man named Alejo TUCI in Colombia. Originally, TUCI was a combination of ketamine with other drugs, typically party drugs like MDMA or methamphetamine. According to some users on a drug forum, TUCI is the drug of choice of many people in South America, let alone Colombia. But as the drug gained popularity and spread further out of South America, the recipe changed rather dramatically, essentially making the drug some sort of chemistry-themed game of telephone. It seems that the brand name got popular and everybody wanted to cash in, but they didn't know the recipe, so they just kind of made it up. And that's what makes this drug extremely dangerous, on top of the obvious element of taking illegal illicit substances. Just think about it. 5 people who have taken TUCI could be discussing their experiences together, but all be talking about extremely different concoctions that they took, which makes this dangerous because if you don't know what you're taking, which unless you test it is the case for this substance, the way that it affects your body is going to change significantly and could very easily cause death. One user states that he was actually offered some from his dealer and he bought it, but he was at least somewhat smart and had it tested. He said it was a pink powder that smelled like strawberries, but when it was tested, it turned out to be a mixture of caffeine, ketamine, MDMA, and a bit of meth, which he obviously didn't take. Others on this forum claimed that they've taken TUCI that has had LSD mixed into it, creating a very extreme psychedelic experience that, according to them, was not pleasant. One rather ominous comment on this forum simply reads, "Hey guys, stay clear of this stuff. I'm having a massive mental breakdown. So intense. What can I do for relief? Please advise if you know anything medically." This brings me to my next point. Taking unknown chemicals is bad enough, but taking an unknown mixture of chemicals is even worse. When you mix chemicals, your body doesn't process each of the individual effects from each chemical and stack them on top of each other. Typically, one of two things happen. Firstly, your brain processes all of the stimuli as one input, causing a system overload which could end a number of different ways. This danger is only amplified when you take substances with very contradictory effects. For example, if you take a stimulant which increases your blood pressure and mix it with a depressant which lowers your blood pressure, you are simultaneously telling your body to speed up and slow down your heart rate at the same time, sending your brain extremely mixed signals, which can very easily lead to death. Now, secondly, on top of just having a system overload, your body can, instead of just processing everything as one input, it can actually take the inputs that you gave it and produce a new input in your body. Your body is literally a master chemist, so if you give it the wrong combination of chemicals, it will make something you likely don't want. So yeah, in case you need a recap on why TUCI is so dangerous, the name itself is deceiving and confusing considering it sounds the exact same as a completely different drug. It has famously been used to take advantage of people. Its exact origin is unknown, and 9 times out of 10 you're probably going to get a random concoction of drugs that you shouldn't be taking, individually or especially combined. I don't care if it's pink or smells like strawberries. TUCI is diabolical, and yet it's one of the more tame entries on this list. Let's move on. TUCI B. Following the first segment, I almost felt compelled to add this drug as an entry. Admittedly, it's not the most crazy or obscure drug I've covered in this series, but it's still a crazy compound and has a story worth telling, especially if I was going to reference it so much in the first section. I figured you guys would be at least a bit curious about what the real TUCI was all about. TUCI is also commonly known as bromomescaline, bromo, nexus, or Venus, and is a synthetic psychedelic drug that was first synthesized in 1974 by Alex Shulgin. And it gained popularity initially for its potentially therapeutic uses, but has since been limited to primarily recreational use, which we'll get into. The reason why TUCI was dropped by the psychiatric community as an aid in therapy was due to the fact that it caused gastrointestinal effects and had a lack of empathogenic effects, which in simple terms means it failed to cause the same level of emotional openness as other drugs serving a similar therapeutic purpose. It's easy to see how an empathogenic would be beneficial for a psychologist or a psychiatrist, but if it doesn't serve that purpose and only makes them horny and gassy, I could see why it was also dropped rather quickly. Like, could you imagine seeing a psychologist and they give you this newly synthesized random chemical compound that they think might help you, but in reality you felt the same and just farted more? That would kind of suck. But unfortunately, it wasn't just that pleasant. Some psychiatrists initially would actually dose their clients with this without them knowing, as they believed that it helped their clients be more open and introspective, and I guess gassy too, but jokes aside, that's definitely not cool. It is a bit of an unfortunate mix that an aphrodisiac can give you stomach issues. Definitely something you do not want to mix. Like, all I'm saying is if Viagra had a side side effect of diarrhea, it probably wouldn't be all that popular. Now, although it failed in psychiatric cases, it definitely gained popularity in the party scene as it was known as the most powerful sex-enhancing drug of all time. In fact, during the 1980s, several different companies manufactured and sold TUCI as a sexual enhancement product. Basically, one of those gas station boner pills, which is pretty crazy considering this drug is half stimulant and half hallucinogen, with some people comparing it to MDMA combined with a psychedelic. According to studies, even low doses of this drug in young chickens have shown to produce similar effects to low doses of amphetamines. So I don't know why they tested this on young chickens, but yeah, young chickens took it and acted like they were on meth, which also means that at some point they gave these chickens meth too. So I feel really bad for these chickens, and some of you fiends watching envy these chickens. So yeah, strange, but I guess the low doses where it gives you the aphrodisiac and social effects. Normal doses give you the slight psychedelic and slight amphetamine effect, and high doses are a rather strong psychedelic experience. But to be fair, this drug isn't extremely unknown, and it's also not the most insane drug I've covered. But what is crazy is a drug that is commonly mistaken for TUCI, known as Bromo Dragonfly. Bromo Dragonfly was first synthesized in 1998 and is an extremely potent chemical compound. For example, this drug is measured in micrograms, not milligrams, micrograms, which is extremely dangerous because this compound is toxic to humans at even moderate doses, which is extremely dangerous because if you think you're taking TUCI, but you are taking Bromo Dragonfly, if you take even a low dose of what you think is TUCI of Bromo Dragonfly, you will be dead. Bromo Dragonfly is 20 times more potent than TUCI, and because of unfortunate mix-ups, at least 5 people have been reported to have been killed from Bromo Dragonfly toxicity. On top of death, people have also lost limbs due to Bromo Dragonfly, as in one case, a 35-year-old Swedish man had vasoconstriction in one of his legs, leading to necrosis in one of his feet, basically meaning his blood vessels narrowed to the point where blood could not effectively get to that part of the body, and part of his foot died and had to be amputated, all because of this drug. Bromo Dragonfly is likely one of the more dangerous and scary aspects of TUCI, and although it's a completely separate compound, they are often mistaken for each other, as there is a variant of TUCI known as TUCI fly, which is often mistaken as Bromo Dragonfly, which is a deadly mistake due to, like I said, the 20 times difference in potency. Bromo Dragonfly is a rather mysterious and elusive substance, and honestly, it was kind of hard to gather much more information on it than I've currently gathered here. But yeah, the real TUCI was a mix between LSD and MDMA, at least in low doses, and was even in very low doses sold as an aphrodisiac. And unfortunately, there was a very similar sounding variant that was 20 times more potent and accidentally taken in high doses, which typically led to death or, in fortunate cases, just amputation. Jenkem. So far in this series, we've covered drugs that will make you lose your mind for weeks, instantly kill you, make you lose all control of your body, make you join a cult, and other crazy things. But no drug that we've covered has been, in my opinion, as gross as Jenkem. For some of you, you've heard this story before, and if you haven't, I envy you. But I am about to ruin your day with exactly what it is. To put it frankly, Jenkem is a fermented mix of human waste. In simpler terms, human urine and fecal matter are the primary ingredients for this drug. It's rather rudimentary in nature and only requires you to urinate and defecate into a bottle, allow it to ferment in the sun for a few days, and after just a bit of time, your Jenkem is ready for inhaling. The drug is reported to give a hallucinogenic effect and was first reported in the mid-1990s as a street drug among Zambian youth. In this case, they would do their business in this bottle and attach a balloon on top and leave it in the sun. And as this balloon would fill up with gases, they could tell that their fermented Jenkem was almost ready. Following this, they would take the balloon and inhale their, concoction. This almost sounds like a troll because of how disgusting this would be. Like, not even the best high in the world could convince me to leave my own business in a bottle to ferment in the sun for days to then inhale it. I can only imagine how many people that have tried this drug have instantly just thrown up. I can only assume that this is one of those smells that is burnt into your nostrils forever. As far as the actual effects of this drug, it seems rather underwhelming, especially for what you have to put up with to consume it. But I guess you get what you pay for. This is one drug you can get even if you're piss poor. Get it? The main source of the hallucinogenic effect from this drug typically comes from the hypoxia that it causes, because the fermented raw sewage produces two primary gases, carbon monoxide and hydrogen sulfide. The carbon monoxide can cause an altered state in your brain by displacing oxygen, which, like I mentioned, can cause hypoxia, which can be euphoric but also extremely dangerous and cause potential brain damage and even death. And hydrogen sulfide in low doses can cause irritation to your eyes, nose, and throat. Moderate doses can cause headache, dizziness, nausea, and vomiting. And in high doses can cause shock, convulsions, coma, and even death. I literally can't see any reason why anybody would want to do this. These two extremely dangerous and relatively common gases are likely the least ideal way to get any sort of buzz, and you'd probably be better off just doing some breath work than inhaling poop air. I couldn't find much in terms of trip reports, and I'm honestly glad, because I don't think I'd want to read anything from somebody who would do such a thing. And although this drug is relatively simple and not very well documented, it is still disgusting, crazy, and in my opinion, a story worth telling. And even if the story ended there, I still think it would have landed on this list simply because of the sheer gross out and shock factor. But luckily for you, that's not the whole story. One of the most interesting aspects about this drug is how one high school student was able to use it to troll almost all of America in 2007. I know this is a drug video and not a hoax video, so I'll make this part brief, but it is kind of interesting and honestly hilarious. Long story short, a high school student heard about the African use of Jenkem and thought it was just disgusting, which honestly, fair. But he took it a step further and actually made his own fake Jenkem and planted pictures of it and people using it online in an attempt to cause a hoax. Little did he know that this would get picked up by the police, and because of this, an internal memo was made and leaked, which eventually made it to the news. Once this news broke, it became a widespread panic amongst parents that their child could be getting high off of their own sewage, which is hilarious and idiotic and just insane. There's a really hilarious news segment all about Jenkem back from 2007 when this hoax was going on. And one of my favorite parts is the street interviews they did with people when they were explaining the drug to them and asking them what they thought about it. Let me play that for you quickly.
I couldn't imagine doing something like that.
They need to find something better to do with their life.
Sounds pretty sick to me.
So yeah, to summarize Jenkem, it's literally pee and poo in a bottle in the sun, and it's gross. On top of all of the dangerous bacteria and just disgusting odor, you also risk getting brain damage from hypoxia. And besides the original breaking news from Africa, it appears that most of the widespread information and panic around this drug is based off a hoax or a troll, which is kind of hilarious. Information itself on African use cases of this is pretty hard to find, and although I'm sure it happened in some instances, I can't imagine this is something that's extremely popular. But feel free to chime in if you know anything about this that I wasn't able to find. I think the funniest part about this entire situation is how this Florida news anchor ended this broadcast.
But parents need to be aware that kids are calling it by the more popular slang term, butt hash.
It is unfortunate and upsetting that African youth are resorting to such a disgusting means just to get a little high. And honestly, I don't blame them. But I guess the silver lining is, out of all of this, we did get butt hash. Flakka. Our fun little poop interlude is over, and now we're back to some seriously diabolical particles, of which Flakka is definitely one of the highest rank. Flakka, also known as alpha PVP or zombie drug, is a seriously deadly synthetic stimulant. It triggers surges of both dopamine and norepinephrine in the body simultaneously. This combination can cause aggression, paranoia, anxiety, hallucinations, agitation, psychosis, and more. And physically, it can cause kidney damage or failure and heart attacks. It's not just the combination of dopamine and norepinephrine that cause this too. There's other factors involved, but those are some of the side effects of this drug that I wanted to get to right away, because this drug is insane. I don't even know if this is real, but based off some of the videos I've seen of people on this drug, I would believe it. I guess some people call this drug $5 insanity, which is looking accurate because this drug is extremely cheap, at least relatively compared to other drugs, especially due to its potency, and it literally turns you into a zombie. Hence the zombie drug name I mentioned earlier. The source of Flakka is actually naturally occurring and is commonly used in Africa as a mild stimulant. They take leaves from the cat plant and chew it, and from that they get a mild stimulant effect, which is rather common in Africa and some other places as well. However, although they are chemically similar, the Flakka that you see on the streets are nowhere near natural, and they are all synthetically produced, typically overseas in countries like China. Like some other street drugs, Flakka is known to produce superhuman strength, which is something you've probably heard about in terms like meth head strength or crackhead agility, which is extra crazy because not only are you out of your mind, but you're also go a superhuman on this drug. And one of the reasons why it's so dangerous is because it's 10 times more potent than cocaine and 20 times more potent than MPTP, which is one of the primary ingredients in bath salts. Speaking of bath salts, this drug is a synthetic cathinone, which is a chemical that is chemically related to Pyros. And if you watched our first video, you would know what Pyros are all about. Flakka is a ketone analog of prolintane, which is exactly what inhibits the norepinephrine and dopamine uptake, causing the central nervous system stimulant effect. This drug can be taken almost any way and has been reported to be ingested by smoking, snorting, placing it under your tongue, ingesting it, or even vaping it. The overdose risk on this drug is extremely high because, as we stated previously, the potency is extremely high, but it also enters your bloodstream extremely fast, meaning that if you take too much, the only way you'll really know is by passing out and hopefully waking up at some point to realize you took too much. The entire experience on this drug lasts anywhere from 6 to 8 hours, but the side effects and come down last for days. This isn't quite a trip report, but it's one of my favorite stories relating to this drug. A man in Florida, of all places, I know, shocker, was high on Flakka, walking down the street when he found a particularly attractive tree and attempted to have sex with it. Understandably, the police were called on this aggressive man of this innocent tree, and shortly enough, the police arrived. Obviously, because he was high on Flakka, he was extremely aggressive and was not responding or cooperating with the police at all. And this led the police to tase him. 2 different officers tased this man, and as he was tased, he didn't fall, he didn't even budge. He simply pulled the taser barbs out of his skin and yelled, "I am Thor." And it turns out that he actually wasn't Thor. He was just a Florida man high on Flakka. I just hope that tree is okay. As I was doing research on different experiences and people on this drug, I found 2 interesting trends. 1, there's not many trip reports, just sightings of people on this drug in public. And 2, everybody that's been spotted on this drug is typically naked. Upon further research, I found out why, and it's honestly interesting and scary. Long story short, Flakka increases your core body temperature to over 106 degrees Fahrenheit, which is much stronger than your average fever, and this temperature is also the point at which your muscles start to break down, which is another huge negative side effect on your body. So yeah, this drug makes you really hot, and when you're in such a zombie-like state, getting naked is easy to do and probably feels pretty right. I know we mentioned earlier that this drug is chemically similar to Pyros, and if that's the case, then I wouldn't want to be near anybody on anything similar to Pyros if they're naked and running around with absolutely no fear and with super strength. If you haven't seen the first video on crazy drugs, let's just say Pyros make you really excited. So yeah, even though this drug is cheap and lasts up to 8 hours and makes you feel like Superman, or I guess Thor, it will literally destroy your body, likely kill you, and in the very best case, you will survive, but your life is essentially ruined. So unless you want to do the most realistic zombie cosplay, don't go anywhere near this substance. Although Flakka is ridiculous and every other drug on this list has been crazy as well, the last entry on this list is likely the most crazy, and potentially even crazier than every entry on this list combined, at least in my opinion. Krokodil. This drug, I would say, for anybody watching this video is probably something you've heard of, at least in passing. It's definitely lower on the never heard of scale, but on the craziness scale, it is off the charts, which is why I decided to keep it in this video. Like a few others on this list, Krokodil is a synthetic opioid, which is most commonly known for its use in Russia. If you thought to yourself that Krokodil kind of sounds like crocodile, well, you wouldn't be wrong. And that isn't by accident. The drug's actual name is desomorphine, but it's known as Krokodil because of what it does to your body. Krokodil is most commonly injected, and when injected, it can cause clotting and damage to blood vessels. This causes the surrounding tissue of the injection area to die and rot. This causes the dead skin to turn dark green and get a scaly texture. This is obviously where the Krokodil name comes from, the horribly infected injection sites of this drug. But that's just the beginning. The drug does not dissolve completely in your body, and the clumps of this chemical circulating through your bloodstream can get lodged in other areas and do extreme harm, such as causing infections in soft tissue, ulcers, and even gangrene. Without even knowing literally any other details about this drug, it is safe to say that this drug deserves a spot on this list, but we're just getting started. The fact that this drug is so destructive to your cells upon even first use is insane, but it doesn't stop there. The drug was actually first synthesized in the 1930s in the USA, and it produces an opioid-like effect with a fast onset. It is a powerful morphine derivative and is about 10 times more potent than regular morphine. And the first recorded cases of abuse of this drug appeared internationally in 2002. This helps shine a little bit more light on why people take this drug in spite of how destructive it is to your body. It is essentially an extremely potent, cheap alternative to heroin heroin that can be made with items from the hardware store and the pharmacy. And for that reason, it gained popularity in Russia and Eastern Europe, countries that are poor and typically struggle with substance abuse. And with how easy it is and cheap it is to make, the popularity is unfortunately understandable. Although this drug has an extremely potent and euphoric morphine-like effect, due to its potency, it is extremely toxic and typically causes hallucinations, which isn't super common for other morphine analogs. As far as trip reports go, I was unsuccessful in finding any that were at least verifiable, but we have covered a lot of detailed, extremely potent opioid trip reports in this series so far, which if this is the first video you're seeing, there is 2 others which you can watch after this. Without getting too deep into chemistry mumbo jumbo, there's not a lot more to talk about when it comes to Krokodil. And honestly, the most interesting part about it is how destructive it is to your body and how scarily accurate the name is. This drug is disgusting, destructive, and it's extremely unfortunate that people are resorting to using this. There are videos online of people taking this drug, and it is extremely scary to see. 25I-NBOME. Quite the name, and for short, we'll just call it 25I. Some other popular nicknames are N-Bomb and Smiles, both odd. 25I was first synthesized in 2003 for research purposes, but it only took the drug community about 7 years for it to become popular. In 2010, it began to circulate the recreational drug scene due to the psychedelic effects associated with it, but unfortunately, it was often misrepresented as LSD, which is extremely dangerous for reasons we'll get into. 25I is a potent phenethylamine and is deadly in doses as low as a milligram. This chemical has caused significantly more deaths and dangerous responses than your run-of-the-mill psychedelic. And although it typically comes on blotters and does have a psychoactive effect similar to LSD, that is really where the similarities end. 25I is typically sold as LSD because to the unsuspecting consumer, the effects may be similar. And 25I is considerably cheaper than LSD, giving the distributor an incentive to misrepresent the drug for a profit. However, this fact alone causes a lot of the danger and is a considerable reason why there has been so many deaths and injuries associated with this compound. 25I is potent, and I mean very potent. And unfortunately, that means that there is a very high risk of overdose, specifically when you are taking high doses of this drug. Even the margin between a moderately high dose and an overdose is razor thin. And if you are taking blotters that are not evenly distributed, you could think you're taking a low to moderate dose, but in reality, actually taking a dose that will potentially kill you without you even knowing. This story alone is a great example why people who take recreational drugs should always have them tested, because it could truly save your life. And although the potential life-threatening toxicity and death associated from this drug being either abused or misrepresented as a completely different compound are extremely scary, that's not where the story ends. Obviously, taking this drug and dying is the worst outcome, but it's not the only bad outcome that can happen if you take this compound. Let's focus in a bit on the actual experience of this compound. This drug not only produces visual changes, but can also produce auditory, tactile, and smell-based hallucinations, which to me sounds hilarious and irritating. Like, imagine you just keep smelling something, especially if it's a negative smell and you can't identify the source of where it's coming from. That alone would probably drive me mad. And it is commonly reported that trips on this substance are overwhelming and dysphoric, with some sensations being described as confusion and anxiety, thought loops, the inability to complete basic tasks. And that's on the light end. On the darker end of things, this drug can cause delirium, which could be extremely dangerous for the user itself and those around the user. This is because these delirious states are typically accompanied with aggression and agitation. Due to the sheer intensity of this substance, it is not uncommon for people to experience HPPD or dissociation. HPPD, for those who don't know, means hallucinogen persisting perception disorder, which essentially is the experience of subtle visual cues that they experienced on psychedelics for days, weeks, months, or even years after they took their psychedelic. Typically, this manifests as some sort of visual static, and the specific reason for this happening is unknown, which to me sounds terrifying. When taken sublingually, which basically just means under your tongue or cheek, this drug can last up to 10 hours. And with the negative effects that it's typically reported to have, that's not something I would even want to consider. And I guess kind of a fun fact, if you watched our last video about the deadliest drugs you've never heard of, then you heard me talk about 2CB, which is obviously in the 2C family of drugs. I bring this up because 25I is actually a 2C derivative, which I'm assuming at least a few of you knew. Oh yeah, and I didn't even talk about the physical effects of this drug. Besides the potential terrifying mental experience you could have for up to 10 hours, physically, besides dying, you could also experience seizures, rhabdomyolysis, metabolic acidosis, renal failure, and even coma. And in rarer cases, thrombosis. Due to the nature of this drug being a relatively obscure research chemical, it's hard to pinpoint a lot of information about the exact effects on the human body. However, I was able to gather some user experiences from a popular popular drug forum. One user stated his frustration with this drug even existing simply because of the dangers it proposed with its misrepresentation, claiming, quote, "The very existence of the NB-OME series pisses me off. It's super hard to get real acid now, at least where I live. Most people have no idea that there are dangerous replacements for acid, including the dealers. They seriously think they're selling LSD when they're actually selling 2,5-I NB-OME. This is obviously concerning due to the high likelihood of overdose risk, especially if you think you're taking LSD, which has a much lower risk for overdose, and death for that matter." Another user went on to share their exact experience with the drug by going on to write, quote, "I did this on Halloween with 2 of my friends. We each took 1 tab. Almost immediately I started feeling the effects, and it felt like I was peaking off of 2 tabs. It was enjoyable for like an hour, but then it really started getting bad. My friend threw up multiple times, and I was shaking uncontrollably. My heart rate was insane. My teeth were grinding and they ached. My body high made me feel like I was tweaking out on meth. The visuals were way too intense and overwhelming. I could barely walk, and I felt like I was super drunk. Every time I laid down, I had awful nausea. 4 hours in, and I started having psychosis and very dark thoughts, because I just wanted to end the trip. I couldn't even sleep for 20 hours after the trip ended. 25-I NB-OME makes you feel disgusting and coked out. The visuals feel metal and fake, and your mind feels like it's drunk. I think both of these experiences sum up the dangers and honestly the scariness of this compound as a whole. The experience sounds intense and for the most part unpleasant, to say the least. And with the risk of overdose being relatively high, especially in cases where it's being misrepresented as LSD, which unfortunately is common, the risk for an unpleasant experience is high. And the risk for death is unfortunately not unheard of. Personally, I think the scariest part about this compound is that people aren't even willingly taking it. People think they're taking LSD, but instead they are taking a relatively unknown and poorly documented research chemical with known deaths and negative effects, unknown long-term toxicity, and the potential for at the very least 10 hours of mental torture. But believe it or not, this is one of the most tame entries on this list and even in this series. So with that, let's go deeper. U47700, also known as pink. This drug is a dangerous synthetic opioid and is reported to be at least 7 to 8 times more potent than morphine. And because of that, somewhat ironically, it only takes a dose of roughly the size of the tip of your pinky to be able to kill you. But that's not why they call it pink. I'm honestly not sure why. I guess in some cases it's pink, but not to be confused with pink from our last episode on the deadliest drug. This chemical was developed by a US pharmaceutical company in the 1970s, but for reasons that are not known, the project was abandoned. This drug has never been tested at all. Not on animals, not in laboratory studies. It was synthesized, abandoned, and then seemingly randomly appeared on the illicit drug market. It is not confirmed or even known how, but it is heavily suspected that this compound's recipe has somehow gotten into the hands of illegal drug manufacturers in China, which seems likely due to the fact that a lot of extremely strong, deadly synthetic opioids are produced overseas in illegal drug factories that are unfortunately shipped directly to the United States. In 2016, this drug had a pretty major news circulation due to the fact that it was responsible for the death of 2 13-year-old boys in Utah, which is obviously extremely upsetting and unfortunate. But another even more high-profile death associated with this drug is actually Prince. Prince's formal cause of death was a fentanyl overdose, but according to sources close to the investigation, U47700 was also found in his body. Not exactly a trip report, but one scary experience associated with this drug involves a 41-year-old woman simply looking to heal her back pain. It is claimed that a woman with chronic back pain was taking a prescription drug known as Norco, and when her prescription ran out, she turned to a friend to get a few pills while she was waiting for her prescription to be refilled. And although she trusted her friend and the pills that she got from her friend looked exactly the same as her prescription pills, they were not the same whatsoever. And these were actually counterfeit drugs, not being her prescribed oxycodone painkillers, but actually being a mixture of U47700 and fentanyl. She unknowingly took these counterfeit pills in the morning, and in the passenger seat of her friend's car on the way to work, she lost consciousness and stopped breathing. She was rushed to the hospital and needed to be revived in the emergency department. Fortunately, this woman survived, but this is not the case for everybody. And it is extremely scary how someone thinking they're taking a prescription pill can actually be taking a deadly dose of an unknown substance. This story alone is a great example of why buying any sort of drug off the street is never a good idea. The effects of U47700 are pretty similar to any synthetic ultra-strong opioid, potentially causing constipation, severe and possibly fatal respiratory depression, seizures, psychosis, addiction, addiction, and of course, a very high risk of overdose and death. Now, if you're watching this video and you've watched every episode in the series so far, this may seem like more or less of a standard run-of-the-mill, ultra-strong synthetic opioid, and you're right. And although this drug is scary and crazy and deadly, it's not extremely different from any other designer synthetic opioid. However, I added it to this list for two reasons. One, the first drug I had in this place actually had to be removed because YouTube did not like it at all. And secondly, one thing that makes this drug rather unique, at least to me, is the fact that this drug for a long time was legal. From the 1970s all the way up until 2016, this drug was completely legal and extremely dangerous. And you can imagine when you have an extremely strong and legal opioid, there's no doubt that distributors and manufacturers of illicit substances were using this to cut other drugs or simply try to misrepresent it and sell it as heroin. In 2016, though, under an emergency act, this drug was temporarily categorized as a Schedule 1 substance, which is where it ultimately stayed. In 2015 and 2016 alone, 46 deaths were linked to this specific chemical. This drug may not be the most unique designer drug out there, but it's likely one you haven't heard of. And to me, it's definitely crazy and honestly scary how strong it is and how it was legal for so long. Moving on, Datura. At a first glance, this rather innocent looking flower seems rather nice and looks like something you may have in a bouquet, but this drug is not nearly as innocent as it seems, and it very much so deserves the nickname of the Devil's Trumpets. Datura is a highly poisonous flowering plant that belongs to the Nightshade family. All species of Datura are extremely poisonous and psychoactive, specifically their seeds and their flowers, which, just for a brief, can cause respiratory depression, fever, delirium, hallucinations, anticholinergic syndrome, psychosis, and even death. And due to these severe effects and symptoms, Datura species of plants have occasionally been used not only as psychedelics, but also as poisons throughout history. Traditionally, around colonial times, the psychoactive effects have been associated with witchcraft and sorcery, but to some Native American groups, the Datura plant has been used ritualistically. This plant did play a semi-significant role for these two groups in the past, although knowing what we know now about this seemingly harmless plant, I cannot imagine what would have been going through these people's minds when they took it. One risk factor associated with this drug that most people don't consider is the natural variation of the toxicity depending on specific factors like the age of the plant, where it's growing, and the local weather conditions, all of which can affect how strong the toxins are within this plant. If you're paying attention, you heard me say anticholinergic, which may sound familiar if you watched our second video about crazy drugs, specifically EA3167. If you haven't seen that video, EA3167 was basically a military-funded and produced anticholinergic drug that was made as a bioweapon, which fortunately didn't see much use, but was tested on American soldiers with extremely scary effects, which if you haven't seen that video yet, watch it after this one because that story is insane. Anticholinergic drugs reduce the brain's ability to use acetylcholine, which is essential for almost every function of the brain, including memory, motor skills, thinking, and things like that. So not only do you feel like a crazy person with dementia while you take this drug, but it's also been shown that long-term use of this drug can also literally cause you to develop dementia. I think this is the first psychoactive plant we've covered in this entire series that has been used almost equally as much as a poison as it has as a psychedelic. Maybe not equally, but definitely pretty heavily in both regards. From 1950 to 1965 alone, the state chemical laboratories in India investigated over 2,700 deaths caused by ingesting Datura. And those were just the cases that were investigated, not all of them. Many of these being murders. One thing that is extremely terrifying to me is that you can accidentally consume Datura toxins simply by consuming honey from the wrong species of wasp during the Datura blooming season due to cross-pollination. I think at this point you get the idea, but we haven't even discussed what this drug is like if you take a dose that doesn't kill you and you go into it intentionally looking for some sort of psychedelic experience. Well, for starters, people that ingest Datura typically begin to experience symptoms within 30 to 60 minutes. But the psychoactive component of ingesting can last anywhere from 24 to 48 hours typically, but has also been reported to last up to 2 weeks or longer. Just imagine a 2-week-long nightmare trip. Well, that's been a reality for multiple people. Datura is considered a deliriant, which is, like I mentioned, because of the combination of anticholinergic and psychedelic toxins within this plant, which typically causes a very odd delirium state, usually causing a complete inability to differentiate dream from reality. Besides this, you may experience violent behavior, painful photophobia, muscle stiffness, disrobing, dysphoria, confusion, and amnesia, just to name a few. And considering the fact that some of these can last up to 2 weeks long, that alone sounds like hell. One user on a drug forum had this to say about Datura. You trip so hard, you don't even know that you took Datura. You forget because your memories are imaginary. You could have conversations with friends that you knew from high school, and you could just sit there for 2 hours having conversations with this good friend of yours until you realize that you never even knew this person, and there was nobody else in the room with you at all. Another user claimed, I took Datura. For the next 24 to 36 hours, I was scurrying around my house, fully convinced that there were spies watching me from the roofs of neighboring houses. I could hear them on my roof and stayed away from the windows so they couldn't watch me. And then I started seeing my ex-girlfriend who left me 2 months ago watching me from around all the corners and doors of the house, grinning maniacally, but she would disappear every time I would look. I had several panic attacks and cried from relief when it wore off and I realized I was tripping. But I didn't realize any of it was a hallucination during the experience. Horrifying stuff. I could literally go on for days reading Datura horror stories, and that's simply because almost every experience with this plant is a negative one, which shouldn't be a surprise considering this plant is literally used as a poison. I honestly don't know why anybody would even consider taking this considering all of the information that is now known about it. Literally tried to find a good trip report on this stuff. I couldn't, but it still somehow isn't even the worst entry on this list. Tranq. If you thought fentanyl was scary, Tranq is literally your worst nightmare. Tranq gets its name because of one of its ingredients, known as xylazine. Xylazine is primarily used as a tranquilizer for large mammals, such as horses or cows. This drug was actually first synthesized in 1962 in Germany to treat hypertension, although during testing it was rather quickly shown that this was too strong and too dangerous for human consumption. The FDA denied it, and it is only approved for veterinary uses, which is of course why humans are taking it now. Although it was a wise decision to pull this drug and do no more human testing, that has left us with little to no information on how xylazine affects the human body, which will definitely play into the danger component. The exact origin of the recreational use of this drug is unknown, but at least in the United States of America, it is speculated that this was first used recreationally in Puerto Rico. But this leads to another problem, and the likely reason for this recreational use is because of access. Similar to U47700, this drug is not illegal. Because it has been approved by the FDA for veterinary uses, it is not a scheduled substance. And although it is regulated and ideally only sold to registered veterinarians, there are still shady distributors that are legally selling it online without requiring any proof of veterinary status, which, because of the lack of scheduling, makes this, for the most part, legal. Drug manufacturers and distributors for a while now have been using fentanyl to cut heroin to bring down costs. But now these same people are cutting fentanyl with xylazine to, again, keep costs down, all at the ultimate cost of the user's life. It's important to note that most people aren't just taking xylazine by itself, and Tranq by definition is typically a mix of xylazine and either fentanyl, heroin, or other opioids. Although Tranq has earned its own street name, the risk of it being misrepresented or taken mistakenly by users is still extremely high. Although in some rare cases, people are actively seeking out this substance due to its lower cost. Now, what exactly does Tranq do to your body? Well, we've already kind of gone in depth about ultra strong synthetic opioids in this video already and other videos, so I'll keep this part brief. But it does have an extremely strong opioid effect on your body. But due to the fact that it is meant for animals literally 4 to 5 times our size, the effects are not only much stronger, but also much longer lived. With a typical opioid experience lasting anywhere from 30 minutes to 2 hours, Tranq can last anywhere from 4 to 72 hours. This drug is dangerous, and the amount of overdoses reported have been growing exponentially over the last few years alone. And it is theorized that these numbers are extremely underreported as well too, because most toxicology reports are not searching for xylazine. And because Tranq is cut with xylazine and opioids, typically it's only the opioids that are attributed to the death, meaning that we really don't know how many people have lost their life because of Tranq. All of this information is extremely upsetting, sad, scary, crazy, everything. But one of the most unfortunate parts about Tranq is that it's essentially a death sentence if you do happen to overdose. Most antidotes for opioid overdoses will simply not be effective when you're on Tranq because those antidotes have no effect on the xylazole, meaning that although the opioids may potentially be neutralized, it will likely not be enough to save someone in the case of an emergency. If you watched our last video about the deadliest drugs you've never heard of, then you've heard about a certain zombie drug, Flakka. Well, Tranq is also another zombie drug, which causes similar tissue damage. Tranq essentially eats your body from the inside out, causing cellular death and necrosis in multiple parts of your body, causing you to essentially gain the appearance of a zombie with deep open wounds that are very likely to be very infected. Necrosis in the injection site has always been a risk, but for Tranq, you don't even have to inject it to get these horrible effects. So yeah, Tranq basically just seems like a horrible combination of Flakka and fentanyl, killing your mind and body and potentially even you simultaneously. Moral of the story, if something is used to sedate horses and cows, it's probably not meant for humans at all. GBL. GBL is a chemical that is used in cleaning solutions and nail polish. However, this chemical isn't popular because of what it does to your floors or nails. It's used because your body actually turns GBL into something you've likely heard of, GHB, gamma hydroxybutyrate. GHB has been used for many things, both nefarious and personal uses. This drug is exceedingly popular within the club community due to its social and euphoric effects. In low doses, it's reported to have an alcohol-like effect, making people feel social, and in higher doses can make people feel hypersexual with almost no inhibitions. However, a huge danger of this drug is the dosing, because the response curve on this drug is exponential, meaning that if you just take 10% more of what would be considered a normal dose, you could have an overdose due to your body's exponential response to this compound. Unlike some of the other entries on this list, GBL is actually a Schedule 1 substance, although it has other purposes, so it is illegal in the US. But as you know, this doesn't mean that people aren't taking it. It is important to note that GBL and GHB are not the same, but for the sake of this video, I'm going to be using the information interchangeably as GBL turns into GHB in your body and has very similar effects. Some of the biggest risk factors associated with GBL is the fact that the dosage is small, meaning that only milliliters of this can get you high and even kill you, due to, like I mentioned, the exponential curve in response. Doing precise measurements in a club setting is not ideal and also not common, which makes a lot of room for danger. How this drug typically goes about killing its users during an overdose is simply by respiratory depression and slowed heart rate, either resulting in a coma or just straight up death. In more tame cases, this drug is only known to make you black out completely, remembering absolutely nothing, which is why it was used for very, very unsavory purposes. Not only will you not remember what happens after you pass out, but you likely won't remember what happened at all that entire night. GHB is extremely addictive, and most people that have taken this drug know somebody that has died because of this drug. I'm assuming most of you watching this video likely have some level of familiarity with this chemical, and may even be disappointed that this is the last entry on this list. But the reason why I wanted to have this entry on this list is because of an email that I got from a subscriber. This person found me because of this drug series and felt compelled to not only share a list of the craziest drugs that he's tried, but he also wanted to share his experience specifically with GBL, as he says it was his worst withdrawal experience ever. And he also wanted to share words of caution for the viewers, all of which I'm going to share now. English isn't their first language, so forgive the grammatical errors. It happened like 5 years ago when I met my girlfriend. We were both living in Berlin. We were most active in the clubbing scene. I was prior to that addicted to opioids, so I was interested in trying GBL for the first time. The first time I took it, it felt like a mix of benzos and a bit of MDMA. The second time I took it, I just fell asleep and woke up 10 hours later confused on how I fell asleep. That's what's common when you take too much GBL. You pass out. So then I started doing GBL every day. Soon I noticed I can't sleep without it. It's literally impossible. So the problem with GBL is that when you're addicted to it, you will never fall asleep normally. You will need to take it every 2 hours to fall back asleep. So I woke up every 2 to 3 hours, took it, and then went back to sleep. My addiction went so horrible. I took 60 to 80 milliliters every day of GBL. That's enough to kill 10 people. This year I realized that I can't continue like that. I will die. I have had a few moments where I did almost die due to overdose on opioids, benzos, and GBL. I have had many close calls. I realized I just can't go on like that. Also, with GBL, you need to take it every hour. Otherwise, you are getting withdrawals. In my case, I took it every 5 or 10 minutes. And if I waited too long to take it, I would start to vomit extremely out of nowhere. It was just horrible. I started searching for a hospital here where they could do withdrawal for me. When I was in the hospital, I remember I took my last dose of GBL at 6 a.m. And then at 10 a.m., I suddenly forgot everything. I just don't remember much. I was in a delirium state. And the doctors told me I was super aggressive. I tried hitting them. I always tried to run away. And whenever I had IV drops attached to me, I always ripped them off because I thought they were poisoning me. Then the doctors told my parents we need to make him go into an induced coma. It's impossible to withdraw like this. They tried to put me into a coma but failed 3 times because I had a tolerance to the chemicals that they tried to give me. When it worked, I was in a coma for 1 week. And when I was in the coma, I had severe pneumonia in one lung and almost died there. Luckily, I didn't. After the coma, I was still there for another week. I have a few memories of what happened in those 2 weeks. I didn't even know I was in the hospital. I just thought I was in someone's basement. I thought I was on a Japan trip and a samurai chopped my head off. That's why I was in a basement, because they were trying to reattach it. I also saw a corpse lying in my bed. Then I saw a glimpse of me sitting in a chair while there was a woman under the chair trying to kill me. I also remember I saw snipers standing on the building near me, pointing guns at me. It felt so real because I thought it was. I heard gunshots. Then whenever I looked at the wall, I saw bullet holes in the wall. There was also a voice in my head telling me to run away from this hospital because they were poisoning me and trying to kill me. So whenever my heart rate or anything else got dangerously high, I remember nurses running to me and they would check on me, screaming, "Doctor, doctor." The doctor ran into the room and rammed me with a syringe in my leg because I was dying. dying. I had an extreme seizure. I still have the memory of this seizure, like I was there. I also remember that I had so many seizures. It was like a 24/7 seizure. I couldn't really move, and it was like I was trapped in my body. My arms were always in the air, extremely shaking, but I couldn't move them. When the 2 weeks were over in the hospital, they sent me to a withdrawal clinic where I stayed 3 weeks. It was awful. I extremely shaked for 1 month. I couldn't even eat with a fork or spoon. I was so shaky. When I asked doctors what is wrong with me, they told me I had nerve damage. That really scared me. It took 4 months for the shaking to go away a bit, and I could live my life somewhat normally, but with complications. I still have tremors. Also, my memories are really bad. My short-term memory is awful, and I can't control my emotions, and I just burst out with emotions. I'm telling you this story about GBL because this drug is truly horrible. It's not just the effects that are dangerous, but it's also the withdrawal. You need to stay in an ICU unit in the hospital or you will die. My message to the RC community would be this: stay away from all of this stuff. There are almost no studies available on research chemicals. They are so potent and mostly unregulated. They can kill you super quick. Most of the time, research chemicals are 1,000 times the potency of similar drugs. Seek help and stay away from this stuff before it kills you. I have lost 4 super close friends because of those chemicals. It's a dangerous game, which you sadly can't win. It would be amazing if more people were aware of research chemicals and how extremely dangerous they were. I really appreciate this individual not only sharing their story, but sharing their words of warning as well. These videos are meant exclusively for education and entertainment purposes, and in no way, shape, or form do we advise any use of any illicit drugs at all. I hate to leave things on a negative note, but unfortunately, this is just the reality of these things. I appreciate you guys so much for watching this video, and if you guys are curious about other videos about crazy, deadly, and scary drugs, check out the playlist on screen. There's currently 3 other videos you may or may not have seen yet. I'll see you guys in the next one. Trust me, bro.